The Orville, New Horizons, Season 3, Episode 3, Mortality Paradox. Well, in this week's episode of The Orville, Tala had been home visiting her parents, and she returns to the Orville and lets them know that she had detected a Kaelon warp signature in an area where she shouldn't have. And so they end up checking out this planet Naren 1, where there shouldn't be any life down on the planet. It's a desolate planet. Except when they get there, the sensors show that there are apparently millions of people actually living down on the surface. So Ed, Kelly, Tala, Bortus, and Gordon, they all get in a shuttle and go down to the surface. Except when they get there, there are no people, there are no cities, it's all just trees. And...
which is different than what they were expecting, because the last report of this planet was a desert world.
Yeah.
So even finding trees was not right.
Yeah, yes. I mean, like, so much was wrong when they got down there. So they start heading through the trees and discover an Earth high school. And they enter the high school. Gordon ends up getting bullied by this group of kids who take him into the men's room and basically give him repeated swirlies and tell him that he's got to pay the money to Randall, or else apparently he's going to be in serious trouble. So anyways, after school, they go looking for this Randall character, and it turns out Randall is some sort of, I don't know, like some sort of monster ogre thing.
Like a giant monster. And I will admit, because we've been talking about how there's not been a lot of humor this season, that was actually funny, because he had to meet Randall and either fight it out, or it was like a high school thing, or pay him up or something. So he was expecting some sort of human bully or something, because up to this point, you were just seeing human teenagers, or what looked like human teenagers. Mm-hmm. And it was this CGI giant ogre monster, and Malloy said something like, "Oh, crap!" And it was funny. I mean, I don't do it justice, but it actually was funny when Malloy actually saw who Randall was.
Yeah, this episode actually did have some funny moments. Like, they were in the high school, and they approached the Mean Girls table, and Bortus asked if they could sit down, and of course Mean Girls were Mean Girls, and they said no. So Gordon told Bortus to tell the one girl that she had a 5-head.
He whispered in his ear, so you didn't hear what Malloy said until Bortus actually said it to her.
Yes, and of course she was scandalized, because for anyone who isn't familiar with this term, it's indicating that she doesn't have a 4-head. She has a massive 4-head, and it's labeled a 5-head. So that was actually pretty funny, too. So there were a few jokes sprinkled in.
Because you got back at the Mean Girl. So,
yes.
So that was funny.
Yes, the Mean Girl definitely got taken down a peg or two with the 5-head comment. And so, I mean, so there were some good points as far as the people seeking comedy in the Orville episodes now. It's still there. It's just not as prevalent as it had been in the previous seasons.
Well, this was the most of this season.
Yeah.
But probably starting after that, the humor got turned down.
Yeah. And after they beat Randall, the giant ogre monster thing, they end up on
how he was beaten was Tala picked up this bleacher, I think, and threw it into his eye.
Yeah, that was pretty nasty.
But that's the thing. It was this episode was very hard to get a feel for exactly what it was trying to do.
Yeah, because after they defeated Randall, they end up on this crashing airplane. They manage to land the plane, and once they do, all the other passengers who were on the plane just disappear.
When they walked, I think they're going back in the school.
Yeah, they were going back in.
And when they opened up a door and they stepped in, immediately they were on this plane. And this plane was in a thunderstorm.
Yeah.
And they sat down for a while. And they didn't do this, but I was expecting them to look out the window, like on the wing, and see a gremlin hacking at the wing, like the Twilight Zone episode with William Shatner.
Yeah.
They didn't do that, but I was expecting them to make that joke. I kind of wish they would have made that joke.
I was expecting that too. I was very disappointed that they didn't. That would have been how you do an homage. Not like some other shows we know where they just outright steal people's stories. So I was disappointed that they didn't do that. But it was still good because I liked that in that particular scene, Gordon was able to shine.
He was a pilot.
As a pilot, yeah, because the plane is crashing. Gordon's telling everybody something's not right, I can tell. And so they force their way into the cockpit, and there are no pilots in the cockpit. Nobody is flying the plane. So Gordon takes over, and he actually is able to land this plane, even though they are out of fuel. It's in the mountains. I thought that was a really good developmental moment for Gordon. So I really liked that because we hadn't seen much developed with him so far this season. And what we had seen was very confusing because he
owes Randall money, I do know that.
Well, yeah. But, I mean, as far as his attitude toward Isaac in a previous episode, that wasn't sitting well with me, so this actually helped a lot. So they landed the plane, and they are trying to get out of the plane, and instead of exiting the plane, they end up in yet another room, which turns out to be a Mocklin mortuary, or morgue. So, of course, I mean, it makes a lot more sense now why Tala would press buttons in the room just randomly. But Tala was pressing buttons on the wall, and so the eggs that had all these dead Mocklins inside opened up, and one of them was Bortus. So, of course, Bortus walks over to himself, dead in this egg, just hanging in midair, and dead Bortus reaches out and starts choking live Bortus.
Through all of these vignettes, I guess I'll call them, the one common thing is the person getting attacked. There'll be a moment where their eyes turn white, and then they'll go back to normal. And the crew is trying to understand what that means, because in the first segment with the high school, Malloy, when he was picked up by the ogre, his eyes went white.
Yeah.
Then in the airplane, I believe it was Mercer, didn't he hit his head or something?
Yeah, Ed hit his head.
And his eyes went white.
Yep.
And then in this Mocklin mortuary, Bortus, when he was choking himself, his eyes went white.
Mm-hmm. So they managed to pull dead Bortus off of live Bortus, and they're exiting that room, and there's a staircase that leads to yet another area, and this time they end up outside, and they need to cross this lake in order to get to an area where somebody seems to be signaling with some light. So there's a raft.
Wasn't that Tala's home planet?
Yeah, it was Lake Rule on Zalea.
And up to this point, Ed and the rest of them were trying to figure out, is this a delusion? What's going on? But both Malloy and Mercer, when they got injured, their injuries stayed on their bodies. And then when they were on Tala's planet, Ed said, well, this can't be real, because if it was, we'd all be crushed except for Tala because of the high gravity.
Yeah, exactly. So that's when they knew this was definitely not reality. There was something else going on. So there was this raft for them to get across the lake. Kelly, Gordon, and Tala, they all get on the raft to cross the lake. And they're about halfway across, and you see just this big tentacle underneath the water right where the raft is. And there's this giant octopus thing down in there, and the tentacle reaches up and grabs Kelly and pulls her under. Tala goes after her, but while she's under, wrapped up in this tentacle, you see Kelly's eyes go white, and Tala frees her and brings her back up to the surface. And so once they have beaten the octopus, a door kind of builds itself with some stones around it, and that's when Ed yells at whoever was doing this, just at the sky, I guess, stating that they weren't going to go in, they weren't playing anymore, and they start walking in the other direction. So at that point, they walk off in the other direction, and they detect an energy signature coming from nearby, and it's in this cave, and they go into this cave, and they find a holographic projector. So they destroy that, and they are on this desolate planet. Their shuttle is nearby, and this is what Naren 1 is supposed to look like. So they think that the simulation is over, and they get into the shuttle, and they start heading back to the Orville. They're on board the Orville again, and the Kalons show up, and there's a fight, and it looks like all is lost, like they're all gonna die, because there's a Kalon ship coming right at them. And that's when everything freezes, except for Ed, Kelly, Gordon, Bortus, and Tala. So as it turns out, this wasn't actually Tala. This was one of the inhabitants from that planet Kelly had interfered with back in season 1.
Mad Idolatry, I think was the name of the episode.
I believe you're correct, yeah. So it was the one where Kelly had healed the little girl, thinking that just that much interference couldn't possibly bring about any negative consequences. And instead, it turns out that they build this whole religion around her. Well, that planet, even though it would show up in the Orville's universe every 11 days, for the people on the planet, 700 years would go by in the meantime, and it's been 50,000 years since they had originally visited that planet. So these people on that planet have advanced way beyond anything that the people on the Orville could even conceptualize at this point. And they've gone so far as to seem like the ascended individuals in Stargate. At least that's how I took them.
Yeah, they mentioned, as this entity was talking to Ed, that they no longer allowed evolution to direct their development. So that implies that they were using their own science to not just let nature move things forward, but to advance themselves. So in that 50,000 years, they were guiding their own development, and they're extremely, Stargate ascended beings is probably the best analogy. I mean, you could say maybe a Q, but these people seemed like they were more ascended beings from SG-1 than a Q.
True, but the way that they were interfering, because this creature person, whatever you want to call her, she did all of this to Ed Kelly and the gang because she is immortal and she wanted to feel what it felt like to be in mortal peril. And so that felt to me a lot like how Q would interfere with people for his own amusement. I mean, this wasn't for amusement, this was for a different reason, but it was still the same thing. Interfering with, I'll just say, lower life forms or less evolved life forms, at least from the perspective of the Q or an ascended being, for their own personal
The ascended
gain.
beings usually stayed out of people's business. That was kind of one of the rules.
Exactly, but the Q, however, Q himself had no problem doing that.
The white eyes, what that meant is right before these people were going to die in their simulations, apparently this entity took over their bodies. That's what that white thing was, for that last moment, just to experience right before death.
Yeah.
The only reason it doesn't feel like a Q to me is Qs never seem like they wanted to learn anything. They just like screwing with people. Whereas this entity seemed like it was presented as a she, but I don't think there was any male or female associated with it, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But I think that this person, this entity, was actually interested in learning, and it didn't see any issue with the animals that it was experimenting on, because this entity pointed out you were never in danger, so nobody was ever going to get hurt.
Yeah.
This entity was trying to learn something as opposed to just screw around. But yeah, it's a combination between a Q and an ascended being from SG-1.
Yeah, because as I recall, I believe the rest of the Q continuum, they frowned upon what Q was doing, messing with the humans. In fact, I believe he got in trouble for it. So that was slightly different. So this was more like Q himself as opposed to the whole continuum. At least that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, but this entity got no joy out of doing this.
Well, she certainly got something out of doing it. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been doing it. I mean, she wanted that experience for herself.
And education.
Well, I'm not sure that it was even education so much as a selfish need to have those feelings.
All right, fair enough.
So that kind of bothered me, because the other thing that kind of bothered me about her was the directing of their evolution. That just kind of felt like eugenics to me. So I don't know if they were even meaning to
But isn't that what the ancients did on SG-1?
Yeah.
Yeah, they molded themselves so they could reach that non-corporeal form.
Exactly, yeah. So, again, parts of this episode were good. Parts of it felt sloppy. I'm not really sure what they were trying to do. Well, I think I know what they were trying to do, but it didn't work for me. So, that's my take on that. You, I know, have more to say about that, so you go ahead.
Yeah, the only criticism I have of this episode, and it's the same criticism I made last week, it was too long. The different vignettes that were going on, although I appreciated, because it was hard to figure out what was going on. This wasn't as simple as a holodeck within a holodeck, which has been done on The Next Generation a few times. This was something a bit different than that. So I would criticize that these vignettes, the first one when they were in the high school, maybe that one needed to be that long to kind of get you...
Set the mood?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then the ones after that didn't need to be as long as they were. We get the idea. Just let's speed this along. But the thing that I did like about this, and this contrasts with this week's Strange New Worlds, is from Strange New Worlds, Loki/Angel. The advice that this person was giving Spock was find out who you are and what you are. You're not Vulcan, you're not human, but find out your identity, find out what is uniquely you.
Yeah, because it's more important who you are than what you are.
And this entity was telling Mercer that what's ahead in their evolution is the exact opposite of that. Where you're going is where you you start losing the importance of what self is.
And you become one with the universe.
Yeah, I mean, well, she didn't say that, but that was the implication, is that you realize you're one piece in the universe, that you have, you are one with the things around you. So I thought that was a very interesting contrast, because this week we watched these episodes back to back. We watched Strange New Worlds first and then the Orville. And that same message was done in both episodes. It was done ham-fisted in a non-binary, but it's important you figure out how unique you are in Strange New Worlds. But in the Orville, it was done in a, no, what you need to do is lose that concept of self. You need to figure out you're part of a bigger picture. That sort of message.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that message. I also liked when I was trying to figure out what those vignettes were doing, they were making it very difficult to try to get a grasp on what was going on. Because Tala, when she turned out to not be Tala, because the way they presented and you figured out that there's something wrong here, is they abruptly cut to the Orville as you thought Ed and the rest of them were on the ship and they were getting destroyed by the Kalon. You immediately got this weird cut back to another Orville, where Lamar was talking to Tala, who is coming back from her home planet. And Lamar's like, well, wait a minute. You already came back. What's going on here? And that's when you start having an idea that something's not right with Tala. And the way it unfolded, it took me a while. I mean, I didn't figure this out till the very end, talking to the entity, because I thought, the holodeck within a holodeck. They've done it in Next Generation at least twice that I remember. Once I remember for sure, probably twice. So I thought they were just going to do that. And it's like, no, it really wasn't that. Because they even explained, they kind of gave you a fake out when they were on the fake Orville. And Claire was talking about how this was a mixture of holographic foolery for your senses, and there was some neurological stimuli that was going on as well. So I actually enjoyed this episode. I just wish it was shorter. It didn't need to be... I forget the running time.
It was over an hour.
We could have cut 10 to 15 minutes out of this, and it would have been a much tighter story.
Yeah, I think for me, at one point when it was on the fake Orville, we were led to believe that this was something that the Kalon were experimenting with to convince humans or humanoids that what they were perceiving as reality was reality, even if it was actually just Kalon ships coming to get them. They'd see Union ships. Because
somebody pointed out, I don't remember if it was Kelly or Ed, that with the alliance with the Krill, the Kalon no longer had the military might to win that war. But if this was a new Kalon technology where you could influence the minds of people on these ships, that conventional weapons wouldn't matter anymore.
Exactly. So I found that to be a much scarier concept, obviously, than what it turned out to be, because it was. I mean, that's what I assumed. I assumed it was something like Cardassians screwing with somebody's mind to try to get information from them, making them believe something that wasn't real. That's what I thought that this was, some sort of either experiment or trying to extract information.
Which the Next Generation's done before.
Yes.
I'm glad they didn't do that, because we don't need that sort of derived stuff anymore.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's what I immediately assumed that it was. I'm glad it turned out that it wasn't that, but that ascended being, I didn't really care for.
I enjoyed it. I guess we're going to differ on this one, too. I enjoyed that entity, and I hope we see more of that entity. I like that it tied back to a Season 1 episode, and even in that Season 1 episode, you saw that civilization evolve.
Yes.
Toward the end, where they ended it where they were a spacefaring race.
Exactly, yeah, and more advanced, actually, than the people on the Orville.
They had transporters, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, they did. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't so much that I didn't like that concept. To me, the execution just seemed a little bit clumsy.
The one thing that I will admit, in addition to the running time, this episode was dealing, obviously because of the title of the episode, you can gather where they were going with this. But the only debate that was going on between anybody about mortality was at the very, very end, when Ed was sitting around and talking about the pros and cons of being immortal. And it just seems like I wish they would have expanded on that a bit more.
Yeah.
Instead of making it like the last couple of minutes of the episode sitting at the mess hall pondering this.
Yeah.
I wish they would have actually had a longer conversation about it, because that's the kind of stuff that science fiction, that Star Trek, that's the kind of stuff that would really make this episode shine.
Yeah.
And it came really close for me. but they didn't do that at the end. That quick tie-up that Mercer did at the end, you almost had it.
Yeah, because Ed said that he would want to live forever because he wants to see what happens. And yeah, I mean, that's one side of the conversation, but there was a whole other side that they didn't have. Like, for instance, this being is doing this because it can't die, and it wants to know what mortality feels like. Well, I'll just say this. I mean, I was one of those weird kids reading Anne Rice when I was in, like, the 6th grade. And one of the concepts was you've got these vampires who are thousands of years old, and some of them would go mad because everything was so different. They couldn't handle that. Like, everybody they knew was dead. Everything around them was just completely, it bore no resemblance to what life was like when they were mortal. And they had trouble dealing with being alone and all that change. And I wish that, like you said, I wish they would have explored the immortality more and the pros and cons of that.
And maybe they will later.
Maybe.
I mean, I'm guessing this entity is going to come back. Either her or another one of that group. So they might explore this a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to harp on this subject, but maybe I just spent way too much time with elderly people. But I mean, sometimes you get these older people who just cannot connect with modern times and they just give up and they don't want to live anymore. I've seen that, and it's sad when that happens. And I think this would have been a perfect opportunity to talk about that and what can be done to try to make people feel better about life and the change. I feel this was a missed opportunity.
Well, I would agree with that. I'm looking forward to watching it again because I want to keep an eye on Tala. I didn't start figuring out anything was wrong until the water, when Kelly got sucked down with that squid or whatever, and her eyes turned white, and that's all we saw was Kelly's eyes turn white. And then when they're on the beach, Kelly said, yeah, and I had that same experience, and Tala said, so did I. And it's like, wait a minute, the camera didn't show you, you didn't have that experience, but we just kind of assumed, well, she wouldn't be lying to us. But at that point, it was like, well, something's not right here. Before that, I hadn't really factored that in.
I figured out something was wrong when they were in that Mocklin morgue, and Tala was just randomly pressing buttons. It's like, no, real Tala would know better than to just press buttons on the wall without understanding what she was doing. That, I'm like, no, I don't think so. But I think that was on purpose to give us little clues that something wasn't right there.
So I want to go back and rewatch this, and that is high praise. This was not a perfect episode, but if I want to go back and rewatch an episode, they must have done something right.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this on par with the first episode of the season with Isaac and the suicide conversation. Last week's with the spider people, I enjoyed the atmosphere, but I didn't enjoy that as much as the first episode. I enjoyed this one as much as the first episode of this season. So we'll see where this goes from there. I will restate, though, outside of the humor that they had at the beginning, Seth MacFarlane is clearly making serious Star Trek.
I feel like the humor is missing. For me, it's starting to really hit home that this is indeed a reboot, because it feels like a season 1 all over again, as opposed to season 3.
Oh, I would agree. It does feel like a season 1. They did add more humor. The Malloy on the playground, that was funny. And maybe they're gonna, as the remaining episodes, maybe they're going to start injecting more and more of that humor in there.
I hope so, because they're wasting Gordon's character. That actor who plays Gordon, he is just such a fun comedian when it comes to his acting skills. And I really hope they start utilizing those more like they used to, because it's really a shame to let that go to waste.
They did use the new shuttles, and the outside looked neat. The inside, I don't know if you remember from season 1 or 2, but like the seats that they had were essentially like DX racer chairs. They just kind of painted over them. Mm-hmm. They had all new seats for the inside of the shuttle here. The interior looked really nice. So those new shuttles, both the outside and the inside, they look really nice. Maybe I'm the only one that cares, but it is what it is. So I personally would recommend this episode. I enjoyed it as much as the first.
Yes, I would recommend it too. So let us know what you thought. Definitely go ahead and comment, because obviously we love to interact with the people who watch our videos. Mm-hmm. Definitely, if you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. Helping us get to 1,000 subscribers would be fantastic, so we can get monetized and we can actually bring you more content. So hit the subscribe button if you're not subscribed.
Take care.